G'das, willkommen in einem Afrikaans video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 14 of my organisational series. In this case I'll be providing a view of the German World War II brigades and division combat strengths during World War II and how they changed during the entire duration of the war. I'll be using the point system from the Corps Commander set of rules to determine combat strengths of various battalions, regiments and brigades. If you want more details about that, please view my earlier videos. You will need to understand that tanks operate very differently from infantry, thus it's difficult to compare the two. However, comparing tanks with tank battalions is valid, as is comparing infantry with infantry. The Corps Commander point system is reasonably good, but it can never be 100% accurate, and as a result I divide by 250 and thus show a higher magnitude or order of level of point system. Thus you know that if a battalion had a strength of 2, it is absolutely weaker than a battalion with a strength of 3. At least officially, the Germans began World War II when they invaded Poland in September 1939. Shortly afterwards, the French responded and launched a minor Saar offensive, which did not really achieve very much. The initial German divisions were divided into waves. This shows the 1st and 2nd Wave Infantry Divisions, which were reasonably similar to each other. As with many infantry divisions, the German infantry divisions were centred around 3 infantry regiments, each of 3 infantry battalions, which had a typical combat strength for the period. Supporting this was an engineer battalion, which was reasonably powerful, a reconnaissance battalion, and an unusually powerful anti-tank battalion, which was powerful because it also contained anti-aircraft assets. For the Polish invasions, the Germans did also use most of their 3rd and 4th Wave structure divisions, which differed in the reconnaissance battalion from the 1st and 2nd only. The reconnaissance battalion was more powerful due to additional support weapons being part of the battalion. Besides this, it was identical in terms of combat strength to the 1st and 2nd Wave infantry divisions. The motorised infantry divisions were basically infantry divisions in trucks. Apart from the trucks, it differed little from a leg division, but the trucks did allow it to deploy heavier weapons quicker than a leg division. This was especially evident for artillery and indirect support weapons. The reason why the motorised infantry division battalions seemed to have a high combat strength was due to its motorisation. Thus, when used in a static position, this division probably differed very little from a leg division, but in a mobile situation, it had significant additional combat effectiveness. In 1939, the Germans had 2 basic types of armour divisions. The most successful were the standard Panzer divisions. While the Panzer divisions were tank-heavy, as many armour divisions of the time were, this division was reasonably balanced with infantry and artillery support. The biggest issue in Poland was the Germans often did not support their tanks with their infantry, which was available. It was to take a while before the Germans learnt to break up their regiments into combined arms groups and to operate accordingly. The German Panzer Division had a rather strong armoured engineering battalion, motorcycle battalion, armoured car battalion and an anti-tank battalion. These formations contained significant combat strength under divisional control. The artillery regiment was reasonably standard, although it was motorised. The Panzer Grenadier Battalion was rather powerful. At the time, they were not equipped with an armoured half-track. The Panzer Regiment was reasonably powerful, but as most of the tanks were light, it had no real advantage over its opponents. The second type of armour divisions were the light divisions, which performed reasonably well, but after the Polish campaign they were converted into Panzer divisions. The light division heritage were the cavalry divisions, but nonetheless they did resemble the Panzer divisions reasonably closely, although the various light divisions did differ from each other as well. This is probably the closest to a standard light division. Light divisions consisted of divisional support, an artillery regiment which lacked any 15cm howitzers, a motorcycle regiment, a Panzer Grenadier regiment and a Panzer regiment. The strengths did differ in some cases from the Panzer divisions, but when you look at it closely you can roughly see that it followed the Panzer division basic format. At least if you line up all the battalions, they seem to be fairly similar. After the Polish invasion, there was a period of phony war. The Germans then invaded Denmark and Norway. This was shortly followed by the invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium and France in May. In 1940, the bulk of the infantry divisions were similar to a 3rd, 4th Wave infantry division. The 1st, 2nd Wave divisions were there, as were weaker divisions that were much lower waves, but the bulk were probably similar to what you see here. There was no changes from the 1939 3rd, 4th Wave structure. The weaker divisions did have less artillery. There was a lack of 15cm guns, for example, and of course the 1st Wave, you can go back to the 1939 structure to see what they're like, but basically their reconnaissance battalion was slightly weaker. The motorised infantry divisions performed reasonably well in Poland and were not changed for the French campaign. There was no structural changes from the 1939 motorised division. The SS formed its own motorised division for the invasion of France in 1940. It did differ slightly from the Wehrmacht version. The SS motorised division contained more anti-tank weapons and a separate anti-aircraft battalion. The infantry regiments did have additional support weapons added as well. On the other hand, its artillery was weaker. The Germans were the first nation to form a paratrooper division, although the Russians did have paratrooper brigades earlier. The 1st paratrooper division was little more than 2 regiments under normal divisional or nominal divisional control. In 1940, the division did not operate as a single division, but as regiments or even smaller formations. The 1st paratrooper division consisted of 2 simple paratrooper regiments. After the Polish campaign, there was no changes to the Panzer Division, although the light divisions were converted to Panzer divisions, and these could have a slightly different structure. There was also differences between the Panzer divisions based on the tanks that was contained within divisions. In this case, this is a standard pure German Panzer division, and was probably about the closest that we have to a standard Panzer division in 1940. Compared with 1939, there was no fundamental changes to the Panzer division in 1940. The next combat the Germans were involved in was in Libya, when they launched an offensive in March against the British. When the Italians were defeated by the British in Libya and were forced back, the Germans quickly sent a light division down to assist them. The light division was an ad hoc formation made up of whatever battalions were available to ship to Libya which were suitable for operations in the desert. This light division contained a small tank destroyer battalion, which rounds down to 0 in terms of combat strength, but I added here because it was an interesting formation to be in a under divisional control. It also contained a self-propelled anti-aircraft battalion. The artillery was very weak, containing only a single battalion of 10.5cm howitzers. The infantry, all motorcycle mounted at this point, were rather powerful. The tank regiment was standard, with each battalion being stronger than the 1940 battalion because of more better tanks being present. Basically less Panzer IIs and 1s and more Panzer IIIs. After the earlier German offensive in Libya, the Germans were involved in defending against the unsuccessful British counterattacks which occurred between May and October in 1941. After the 2 unsuccessful British counterattacks, the 3rd, CRUSADER, was successful and the Germans were forced back. When Rommel launched his initial offensive, the 5th Light Division was not fully in place. This, however, shows the final structure of the Light Division which was sent to Libya. We can now see the formations which had not made it to Libya in time to be involved in the first offensive, now in the division. The infantry was also beginning to adopt a more normal infantry, a battalion or regimental structure rather than a motorcycle structure. The formation changes were the engineers were added and the tank destroyer battalion gained additional tanks or vehicles to get a combat strength of 1. The infantry lost strength as it adopted a more standard infantry structure or got diluted. The Panzer battalions grew in strength as the number of Panzer IIIs grew. Further north in the Balkans, the Germans launched their invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. This was then soon followed by the June 1941 invasion of Russia, a titanic struggle between 2 powerful forces. After successfully advancing in the north and centre, the Germans then swung south and destroyed the Russian defenders down in the south around Kiev. When the Germans invaded Russia, they did modify the support elements of the infantry divisions. While some new equipment was available, the supply of newer anti-tank guns was not initially seen as a high priority. The main change between 1940 and 1941 was the infantry regiment support formations were beefed up. More significant changes occurred to the motorised divisions. After the French campaign, there were quite a few changes implemented in these divisions. The anti-tank and infantry regiments were beefed up, but the division lost its medium howitzer battalion, at least for the initial parts of Operation Barbarossa. The changes were that the anti-tank battalion was beefed up, but the 15cm artillery battalion was lost. The infantry regiment was also significantly beefed up. For the German SS motorised division, the same changes were being implemented, but in addition to that, the other main thrust was to align this division to a standard Wehrmacht division. The SS motorised division was effectively, in terms of combat strength, identical to the standard Wehrmacht motorised division. The airborne divisions were involved in the invasion of Crete rather than Russia. By the time the Germans did invade Crete, the airborne divisions possessed reasonable support formations such as artillery, anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns. The paratrooper regiments were now all similar in strength and were filled out, but the biggest change was the addition of an engineer, machine gun, light howitzer, anti-tank and AA battalion to the division. It was now a proper division. After the French campaign, the Germans reorganised their panzer divisions. The other significant point or change was the way the formations operated. The Germans began to break up their panzer divisions into combined arms Kampfgruppen, with one consisting of the Panzer and one Panzer Grenadier Battalion and the other the Recon and Panzer Grenadier Battalion. The new structure of the Panzer Division, and it was quite a significant change, was that it now consisted of only a single Panzer regiment and two Panzer Grenadier regiments. This allowed them to increase the number of Panzer divisions. The anti-aircraft battalion was added to the Panzer Division. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment support was beefed up, as well as the individual battalions. This was achieved by adding more support formations and newer weapons. The tank regiments did lose some tanks as the Germans replaced the light tanks, Panzer Is and possibly Panzer IIs, with medium tanks, Panzer IIs. This did have a minor combat strength impact, for the positive. After a period of redeployment after pocketing the Russians at Kiev, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon in October, which resulted in the Germans getting to the gates of Moscow. The biggest change which occurred with the German infantry division was the supply of new, more powerful anti-tank guns, which became an urgent requirement after the Germans encountered the T-34 and KV-1. The divisions, after almost 4 months of constant operation, were beginning to experience manpower issues as well, so this shows a full-strength infantry division. The anti-tank battalions were beginning to receive the new 5cm anti-tank gun, increasing its combat strength. I must admit, initially the 5cm guns went to the Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, so very few infantry divisions benefited, but they were certainly going to get them, as well as other anti-tank guns such as reboard Russian 76.2mm guns. As for the Panzer divisions, after 4 months of hard fighting, the Panzer divisions had all suffered significant losses, reducing their overall tank strength. Some adjustments to the structure also occurred in the field, even though it was not official, in order to compensate for these casualties. The 2nd Panzer Division contained only 2 Panzer battalions in the regiment. The Germans were beginning to pair up single Panzer battalions with a motorised battalion. For a number of the Panzer divisions, the motorcycle battalion was removed. The final one wasn't removed until well into late 42, early 43, but it was beginning to occur now. The Panzer battalions were losing tanks and their strength dropped as a result, as you can see here. Back in the desert, Rommel launched his second offensive between January and April 1942. The Germans then were involved in the Battle of Gazala, which was possibly the most intense fighting in Libya to date. By May 1942, the 15th Light Division had become a full Panzer division. Because the origin of the Light Division was, it was a light division and had originally been a Panzer division, there was a lot of variability in equipment and formations, even though it was now called a full Panzer division. The division, or the 15th Panzer Division, contained reasonably powerful divisional support formations. while the other battalions under divisional command followed the basic divisional structure, but did vary in strength from, for example, the panzer divisions in Russia. The artillery regiment still remained very weak. I'm uncertain why this is the case. It's probably because that's all there was at the beginning and they didn't ship any additional battalions. The infantry regiment still contained a machine gun battalion armed on motorcycles, but was otherwise similar to a standard Panzer Division's Panzer Grenadier formation. After the victory at Gazala, the Germans followed the British all the way to Alamein, where they fought the First Battle of Alamein between August and September 1942. This was then followed by the Second Battle of Alamein, which is when the British counterattacked and finally defeated the Germans, and this occurred between October 42 and January 1943. Meanwhile, at the other end of Africa, the Allies had landed in Algeria and Morocco, and the Germans were rapidly sending forces to Tunisia. The other Panzer Division, which accompanied the 15th, was the 21st Panzer Division. As the 21st Panzer Division was always a Panzer Division, it contained a more standard artillery regiment and Panzer Grenadier regimental structure than, let's say, the 15th contained. The artillery regiment contained the standard number of artillery battalions you would expect in a Panzer Division, including the 15cm medium battalion. The Panzer Grenadier regiment was also standard, as it did not contain a machine gun battalion or troops on motorcycles with machine guns. The Panzer regiment was also more powerful, mainly due to having a higher number of better tanks. Meanwhile, back in Russia, after the Germans got to the gates of Moscow, the Russians counterattacked and launched their winter offensive between December 41 and May 1942. Officially, there were no actual changes to the infantry division, but in practice, most of the divisions in Russia were experiencing severe manpower issues. Many divisions formed 2-battalion regiments to ensure battalions remained at full strength. The infantry were receiving more advanced weapons such as medium machine guns, RPGs and other infantry support weapons, which did have a positive impact on their combat strength even though the manpower was dropping. In addition, the regimental support formation received additional formations, increasing its strength as well. The German 11th Panzer Division was involved in the German defence against the Russian winter offensive, and while a reasonably standard Panzer Division did have unique organisational features considering the emergency situation the Germans were in at this point in time. The Germans were beginning to ship improved tanks to their divisions as well as anti-tank guns in order to counter the Russian T-34s. This did have a positive impact on the combat strength, even though the numbers of tanks often were quite low. The 11th was a reasonably full-strength Panzer Division. Many of the other divisions were not this strong. It had a powerful motorcycle battalion, which was re-added to the division. Actually, it wasn't re-added. The last division that I showed was one where this was disbanded due to lack of manpower. This just happened to have it because it was still part of their standard organisation. The artillery regiment lacked 1 battalion in this case. The Panzer Grenadier regiment had an anti-aircraft battalion in them, and the regiments differed in strength slightly within the regiment. The Panzer battalions were increasing in strength due to new equipment arriving. After the Russian winter offensive had been fought to a standstill, the Germans launched their 1942 summer offensive, Fall BLAU, between June 42 and October 42. By June 1942, many of the infantry divisions in Russia were down to a 2-battalion regiment, even though that was not yet the official structure. This shows a full-strength infantry division. In this full-strength division, there were no official changes. The motorised divisions were also experiencing significant changes. As they were beginning to operate very independently, its reconnaissance was beefed up to give it a bit of armoured push, and the medium artillery's howitzers returned. A motorcycle battalion was added, and the medium howitzer battalion was added back. The German 9th Panzer Division was involved in the German 1942 summer offensive. While there was a lot of minor changes, at this scale the division was pretty much the same as the previous official Panzer Division structure. As a result, there were no changes to the combat strengths of the individual battalions in this division compared with the last division that we showed you. After the German summer offensive had basically been fought to a standstill, the Russians launched their 1942 winter offensive. The manpower issues, which were already quite significant, were not getting any better, and they were really beginning to cause long-term manpower issues. While additional infantry support weapons did assist in maintaining the combat strength of the various formations, it could not overcome the dramatic reduction of manpower. The 2-battalion regiment was becoming the norm for Russia, although not in other theatres. The infantry battalions had lower manpowers, reducing their combat strength, even for divisions which adopted the 2-battalion regiment. Moving to the motorised division, the only real change, at least for the 16th Motorised Division, was the enhancement of the engineer battalion. The engineers were beefed up in this particular case. I'm not sure if this was a standard improvement or if it was just unique to the 16th Motorised Division. The 11th Panzer Division was involved in the German attempt to relieve Stalingrad and later the counterattack around Kharkov. This division was not at full strength, and some formations were disbanded and distributed to the Panzer Grenadiers. For this Panzer Division, the Engineer Battalion and Anti-Tank Battalion were stronger, primarily because of new equipment. The Motorcycle Battalion had disappeared. I'm assuming it had been distributed among the Panzer Grenadiers. In this division, the Artillery Regiment was stronger, an additional battalion. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment consisted of one battalion equipped with SDKFZ 251 armoured personnel carriers. The Panzer Regiment was weaker, but this was due to losses, not to do with any organisational changes. Swinging back to Africa, the Germans were involved in a counterattack in Tunisia and then their ferocious defence of that location. In 1943, the infantry divisions were finally reorganised, with the reconnaissance battalions being replaced with a Fusilier battalion. In Russia, the 2-battalion regiment was standard, but this standard was now being adopted elsewhere, in this particular case in Tunisia. There were no major changes, although the reconnaissance battalion was now replaced with a Fusilier battalion, which is basically infantry, but it was made of the best troops, possibly slightly more mobile, and this had a similar strength. At the infantry regiment level, the number of battalions was reduced. As indicated, they're down to the 2-battalion regiment. The 10th Panzer Division was a Panzer Division quickly sent to Tunisia. It was organised in a standard manner when it arrived. By 1943, a number of the earlier unofficial changes had become official, such as the lack of a motorcycle battalion. The divisional strength formations were standard for the period, in the east and also other locations, with the Panzer Regiment being more powerful due to it being full strength and equipped with Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs almost exclusively. After the German defeat in Tunisia, the Germans were forced to defend Sicily between July 43 and August 43 against the Allied amphibious invasion. After being forced out of Sicily, the Germans were once again defending against an Allied amphibious invasion, this time in the south of Italy. In Italy, the infantry divisions retained their full theoretic strength, at least initially in the campaign. The engineers in this division began to receive new weapons, specifically anti-tank mines and other weapons of the sort, increasing their strength. The divisions in the west often used the older 3-battalion regimental structure, even though now the structure had changed to a 2-battalion regiment. In mid-1943, the motorised divisions experienced their biggest change, being converted into Panzer Grenadier divisions. This mainly resulted in the division gaining tank destroyers and assault guns. Unofficially, they often had Panzer battalions attached to them. In the new Panzer Grenadier Division, the infantry regiments were beefed up while the motorcycle battalion and one artillery battalion was lost. In this case, a Panzer battalion was attached, but this was not a standard arrangement. The anti-tank battalion gained tank destroyers, which dramatically increased its strength. The anti-aircraft guns were deployed in a separate battalion now. Back over in Russia, the Russians were launching their Donets campaign. After the Russian Donets campaign was forced back and quite a few formations or Russian formations destroyed, things stabilised for a while until the Germans launched their 1943 summer offensive, Operation Citadel. While this shows a full-strength regiment, it was rare for a 3-battalion regiment to be present in Russia. In reality, the divisions were more often not weaker than this. The interesting point about the German structures, when they came up with a new structure, often older formations or divisions retained their old divisional structure. So as the war progressed, you could find divisions having all sorts of legacy and new structures in place. Apart from the fact that 3-battalion regiments were quite rare at this point in time, there were no basic changes to the battalions of the infantry divisions. The Grossdeutschland was not a normal Panzergrenadier division and was a very well-equipped elite formation. This structure was used at Kursk during the German offensive. This was an incredibly powerful division and not typical. The biggest difference between this formation and a standard Wehrmacht Panzergrenadier division was the addition of a Panzer regiment as well as an attached Panther Panzer battalion. As this is a rather unusual division, I'm not going to be comparing this with any of the previous Panzergrenadier division, but it did contain a lot of interesting weapons, so let's cover it. The Tiger battalion was so weak because so few tanks were in that battalion. The Panther battalion was so strong because so many Panther tanks were placed in that division or battalion. After the unsuccessful German summer offensive in 1943, the Russians launched their autumn offensive between September 43 and December 1943. The 7th Infantry Division was a reasonably powerful division for Russia during this period. When the Germans deployed new divisions or prepared for offensive operations, often the infantry divisions could reach their theoretical full strength, which is the case here. Apart from the fact this was a theoretically full-strength infantry division, there were no formal changes to the structure or the battalion strengths. This shows a more normal German Panzer division of the period in 1943, between September and December 43 in this particular case. This Panzergrenadier division had a Stug battalion as its armour, but was generally unchanged from the previous standard Panzergrenadier division. While there's always a lot of focus on the Tiger tanks, Panther tanks and Elephant tanks, the standard Panzer divisions were equipped with bog standard Panzer IVs, which were still highly effective. This probably represents the closest to a standard full-strength Panzer division for the period. Tank strength did, however, fluctuate wildly if you ever actually look at the regimental strengths during different months. For this Panzer division, and after the changes which occurred in 1943, divisional support and the Panzer engineers were beefed up. The anti-tank battalion had been replaced with a tank destroyer battalion. A self-propelled howitzer battalion was becoming standard in the artillery regiment. An SDKFZ 251 equipped battalion was becoming standard in the Panzergrenadier regiment, or at least one. At the time, the standard medium tank was the Panzer IV with a long barrel 7.5cm gun. The Russians then launched their major operation to clear the Ukraine, beginning in December 1943 and ending in April 1944. Their 43 winter offensive, basically. Also, as part of their winter offensive, they drove to the Baltic states, which also ranged from between December 1943 and April 1944. Over in Italy, the Allies were launching their major offensive between ANZIO and Rome, which raged between January 44 and June 44. By 1944, it was even rare to find 3-battalion regiments in the West, or at least in Italy. In the Western Front, that is in France, the battalions could be up to full strength because they hadn't been involved in any combat, but could be manned by rather not untested troops or things like stomach battalions and things of that nature. The equipment mix could also be highly variable, with many divisions using previously captured weapons. However, for the most part, the standard infantry divisions were still formidable formations, at least in 1944. The 72nd Infantry Division used a 2-battalion regiment. There were additional new weapons arriving, such as the SG-44 or Sturmgestell 44, the RPGs such as the Panzerfausts, and the anti-tank rocket launchers such as the Panzerschrecks. This assisted in boosting the strength of the infantry battalions. The Hermann Göring Division was another unusually elite formation. It was a pure motorised infantry division as it lacked much armour. The main difference here was the high combat strength of the infantry battalions. This possessed a very powerful battalion due to supporting equipment added to the battalions. By January 1944, most panzer divisions had received at least one battalion of Panthers and a number of self-propelled weapons such as the assault guns, Stugs, tank destroyers, etc., and other new supporting equipment. Some divisions had been organised in this manner even as early as late 1943. The Panzer Division in this period was beginning to look very complex, with a number of highly specialised formations. While the battalions stayed together, they were often mixed up with other battalions and supporting formations to meet specific objectives. Up to 3 powerful compartments could be formed if required. There were no changes at the divisional level. It should be noted the anti-aircraft battalion does contain self-propelled air defence guns. The artillery regiments remains the same. The Panzer Grenadiers got beefed up a lot, especially the motorised battalion. One battalion is mounted in SDKFZ 251s and is armoured, but its strength was similar to the motorised battalion because it contained less supporting equipment. By January 1944, most Panzer divisions were equipped with one battalion of Panthers, which made it a very powerful battalion indeed. In June 1944, the Germans had to meet the initial Allied landing in France. While defending in France, in Italy, the Allies were continuing their advance up the Shoe of Italy. This shows the 352nd Infantry Division. There was a lot of variation in the structure of the infantry divisions depending on its location. This division was based on the Western Front and was reasonably well equipped and powerful. This division experienced no structural changes, but of course there were always minor local changes. This shows a typical German Panzergrenadier division based in the West between January 44 and December 1944. While it could vary, the anti-tank battalion was mainly equipped with tank destroyers, the armoured battalion was made up of Stugs, and the increased amount of supporting equipment was increasing the strength of the fully motorised Panzergrenadier infantry battalion. It should be noted that the Panzergrenadiers did not contain any SDKFZ 251s, or at least in large numbers anyway. The Panzer Division structure had reached its peak with advanced weapons and reasonable manpower levels. However, from June 1944, they were to meet their greatest challenge. This shows the German 2nd Panzer Division based in the West. While there were no major changes, some new equipment was arriving, especially at the infantry level, such as the SG-44s, RPGs and anti-tank rocket launchers. Although it was not until later in the year the Germans finally worked out how to actually use their anti-tank rocket launchers. There were no major changes to the Panzer Division in this period, but the Panzer Divisions based in the West were generally of full strength, even if some of the equipment was eclectic. While the Germans managed to keep the Allies at bay for a while, the Allies finally broke through and the Germans suffered significant equipment losses in the West as the Allies liberated France. After fully, or pretty much fully, withdrawing from France, the Germans launched their final offensive in the West, which did make some initial headway, but once the weather cleared and the Allied air power came into the picture, it was doomed. Over in the east, the Russians had managed to retake almost the entire Ukraine, as well as most of the Baltic states in the north. However, the largest disaster for the Germans was the Russians' Operation BAGRATION, which managed to destroy most of Army Group Centre. While Army Group Centre was being destroyed, the Russians broke through in the south and advanced well into the Balkans. The infantry division experienced a major change. After the heavy losses in July-August, the Germans formed emergency divisions which lacked much of the support formations of a typical infantry division. While adequate for defence, it was less adequate for offensive operation. Many of the formerly battalion-level independent support formations were now bundled in a smaller form under the divisional headquarters. The artillery regiments were dramatically reduced and used rather old artillery in some cases, but the infantry remained much the same, at least in terms of numbers, if not quality. There was also a Type 2 emergency division with even less heavy weapons but with more infantry. The infantry tended to be poorer quality in this division, and this was truly something bordering on a militia division. The artillery regiment was reduced to a single battalion. The infantry regiment used a 3-battalion structure, although once again the quality of the troops was quite low. The Volksgrenadier divisions were a special type of division raised in late 1944. Most new divisions raised were of a weaker emergency type, but the Volksgrenadier divisions could be highly effective in offensive operations as well as defensive. There were few regular infantry divisions which were close to full strength, so these divisions may represent the best Germany could field in early 1945 in terms of launching offensive. Compared to a normal infantry division, the support formations were weakened and some were centralised in the divisional support formation. The artillery was particularly weakened, but the infantry remained much the same and were reasonably well equipped. As well as reorganising the infantry divisions, the heavy losses in July-August forced the Germans to dramatically reorganise the panzer divisions. The basic divisional structure remained the same, but the individual battalions were significantly weakened. The divisional support formations remained, but many were weakened. The artillery regiment was strengthened, but the Panzer Grenadier battalions were reduced in strength. The biggest change was the reduction in strength in terms of numbers of the Panzer battalions, that is, numbers of tanks. For completeness, I'm also including the SS Panzer divisions that were formed in the same period. The SS Panzer divisions were elite, they were lavishly equipped. Maybe not the troops themselves being elite, but they were certainly lavishly equipped, kept up to strength, and were incredibly effective formations. The divisional support was identical to a standard Panzer division, but included a assault gun battalion and a self-propelled rocket battalion. The armoured Panzer Grenadier battalion contained additional support equipment, but otherwise the Panzer Grenadiers were the same as the Panzer division, as were the Panzer regiment itself. In 1945, the Germans were on the defensive everywhere. Starting in this case in Italy. Then we go over to France and Germany, where they had to meet Operation Plunder, which was the Western Allied invasion of Germany. On the Eastern Front, the Russians were driving deep into Germany. Finally, the Russians took Berlin in between April and May, and the war came to an end shortly afterwards. For completeness, I've included the Panzer 45 structure. This was never implemented, but does show what the Germans were thinking. The division was significantly weakened, having only one Panther battalion. It was probably a good combined arms formation, but was also affected by a reduction in the quality of the German troops, and began to resemble in some ways a Russian tank corps. The obvious change here was that the mixing of the Panzer Battalion and Panzer Grenadier Battalion. The remaining regiment could have an armoured car battalion attached to give you a second Kampfgruppen. While the number of tanks in each battalion was down, the quality of the tanks made up for it in terms of combat strength. Let's now look at how the division changed during the war. I will only be looking at the standard infantry division and standard Panzer division. This shows all the German infantry division structures and battalion strengths in the first half of the war. While there were constant minor changes, the basics remained much the same. The infantry battalion battalion strength ranged from 2 to 3, and most of the battalions did not really change very much at all. In the second half of the war, we see more changes, although these only became obvious in late 1944 when the Germans raised emergency and Volksgrenadier divisions. The infantry battalions remained consistent in strength, although in reality manpower was dropping, but was kept up to strength in terms of comp strength by the addition of new weapons. Let's now look at the Panzer divisions. For simplicity, I'm not including the Panzer division sent to the desert and any special Panzer divisions such as the SS. We will start with divisional level formations and artillery regiments. What we see here for the first half of the war was reasonable level of stability. The artillery regiment stayed consistent up to the adoption of the self-propelled howitzer battalion. The motorcycle battalion was eventually removed. By the mid-part of the war, the armoured car battalion was significantly beefed up. The anti-tank battalion consistently grew in strength due to new equipment until tank destroyers were being supplied. The anti-aircraft battalion came and went as I suppose it was available and needed. In the second half of the war, the structure remained much the same. Even the 1945 structure at this level was kind of similar. Let's now look at the Panzergrenadier regiments for the first half of the war. The regimental support formations did vary quite a bit, but the battalions were generally stable, growing in strength before dropping again due to manpower issues. The Panzer battalions also slowly grew as the tanks were being upgraded and better tanks were being deployed into the battalions. In the second half of the war, the Panzergrenadier remained reasonably stable, although if the 1945 division was implemented, they would have experienced a significant drop in combat strength. The Panzer battalions continued to grow, but when the number of tanks in a battalion dropped, they reduced in terms of combat strength, but still remained reasonably powerful. And so we come to an end of my rather long part 14 of my video series on organisation, in this case analysing the German army in World War II, specifically the estimated combat strengths of the battalions which made up the division. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.